Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The sun had no business shining that day, yet it spilled light across Greenwalk Estate like it hadn't heard the news. Birds chirped from mango trees as if a heart hadn't stopped beating just 48 hours ago. Inside the pale yellow house with broken wind chimes and a gate that always refused to stay shut, Lillian sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with Malcolm for 15 years. Her wrapper was tied too tight, her breath too shallow. Death had flung her world into silence, and grief lay over her shoulders like a winter coat in a desert. The calls hadn't stopped, condolences from people who only remembered Malcolm's number when death forced their hands. Men with thick voices spoke in parables, women sobbed in broken sentences, but none of it truly reached her. Lillian's world had frozen the minute the doctor removed his gloves and whispered, "He's gone." That one sentence had emptied her, the same way a bottle loses its essence after the cork pops. And now, in the house they built with dreams stacked like bricks, she couldn't find even one word to say. The air smelled of antiseptic and camphor. Malcolm's side of the bed still held the curve of his body. The blanket, still rumpled, seemed to say, "I'll wait for him." But Lillian knew. The kind of silence that followed a death didn't come with patience. It came with finality. Outside, the sound of chairs being arranged in the compound echoed like nails against her skin. The funeral was in 2 days, and nothing felt real. She rose slowly, touched his pillow as if it might call her name, and whispered into the air, "I didn't plan for this, Malcolm. I didn't plan for this part." The morning of the funeral was a tapestry woven with disbelief and sorrow. Greenwalk wore mourning like a black hat tilted to one side, dignified but shaken. White canopies flapped in the breeze, creating shadows that danced like restless spirits. People came in their Sunday best, some with sympathy, others with silent judgments tucked between their folded arms. Lillian sat quietly under the main canopy, dressed in deep blue, a widow's wrapper tied firm around her waist, her head wrapped in matching fabric. Her face bore no makeup, but her eyes carried centuries of loss. The officiating minister read from Psalm 90, but Lillian barely heard a word. The sound of her own thoughts clashed with the hymn book voices. Every time someone mentioned Malcolm's name, she flinched like the syllables were thorns brushing against open wounds. She noticed how Malcolm's brothers, Patrick and Felix, moved about with self-imposed importance, ordering drinks, whispering into phones, shaking hands too long with too many people. Patrick, the elder, wore a face too eager for someone grieving. Felix had a grin he tried to hide under his collar, but it peeked through whenever he thought no one was watching. Lillian noticed. She noticed everything now, the shift in tone, the hungry eyes. When the minister said, "Let us commit our brother to the earth," Lillian rose, her legs trembling. She walked to the gravesite, her steps slow but purposeful, each footfall carrying memories like hidden stones. As they lowered the coffin, she looked up at the sky, then down into the earth, and somewhere in between, she whispered to her heart, "Bury him gently. He was all I had." After the coffin was lowered, and the handfuls of red soil had pattered against the polished wood like the drumbeat of goodbye, the crowd slowly began to thin. People trickled out in groups, some lingering for the food, others for gossip, and a few out of genuine concern. Lillian, drained from the ceremony, slipped away quietly from the back of the compound, needing air not soaked in tears and dust. There was a side wall near the garden, where she often sat in the evenings with Malcolm, sometimes shelling groundnuts or sipping tea. She headed there, away from the eyes, away from the noise. But just as she turned the corner, voices slithered into her ears, low, almost conspiratorial. She froze. Patrick's voice was unmistakable, smooth but sharp like a knife hidden under velvet. "She doesn't know half of what Malcolm owned," he was saying. "The shops, the house in Mayfield, Even the car business, everything. I'll get the documents from his drawer. We'll say it was always meant to return to the family." Felix laughed, that short, stunted laugh he had when he thought he'd won. "She's still in shock. She won't know left from right for months. Let's move quickly. We'll meet the lawyer on Tuesday." Lillian's body turned cold. She had stumbled onto betrayal wearing the face of family. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself on the garden wall. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply walked back, her face unreadable. Something in her had shifted, a quiet resolve rising like smoke from a fire not yet visible. What they didn't know was that the widow they buried their brother with was not the same one walking back to the compound. No, that woman had just been reborn in silence. The house that night was filled with people, but Lillian felt utterly alone, as though she were in a boat drifting through a storm with no oar and no land in sight. People ate and drank like nothing was broken. Plates clinked. Laughter punctuated conversations. The air smelled of jollof rice, sweat, and hypocrisy. Lillian excused herself from the crowd and walked into the bedroom, locking the door quietly behind her. She didn't sit. She didn't cry. Instead, she knelt beside Malcolm's drawer, the one he had always said was for emergency matters. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it open. Inside was a dusty laptop, 2 brown envelopes, and a small black book with pages thick as secrets. She plugged in the laptop, and while it booted, she opened the book. It was filled with notes in Malcolm's familiar cursive, records of properties, appointments with a man named Mr. Hodge, legal correspondence, and thoughts she had never seen. He had written, "If anything ever happens to me before I put this in place, please let her finish what I started. She'll know what to do." Lillian's hands shook, but not with fear. Her eyes burned, but not with tears. She whispered, "I will, Malcolm." By the time the laptop lit up, a new flame had already begun to flicker behind her eyes. Betrayal had knocked. Grief had answered. But now, purpose had entered the room. Morning came without apology. The birds chirped like nothing tragic had happened, and the compound, now stripped of canopies and borrowed chairs, returned to its naked self, quiet, brittle, exposed. Lillian stood by the kitchen window, watching a strand of smoke curl from a neighbor's chimney, like a thin whisper of memory. Her wrapper was loosely tied this time, her hair uncovered, the scarf still soaked from last night's heat. The kettle whistled, but she made no move to lift it. Her thoughts were scattered across the marble kitchen countertop, alongside the butter knife and unopened condolence cards. Her eyes kept drifting to the corridor. Malcolm would have emerged by now with sleepy eyes and mismatched socks, asking her why the toast was too brown. But the house had taken on a different tone, like a drum missing its skin. In the living room, some relatives still lingered, uninvited extensions of sorrow. They sat in awkward clusters, their conversations carefully dodging emotion, waiting for food or for someone else to start the next round of gossip. One of the aunties from Norwood whispered loud enough for Lillian to hear, "She hasn't cried much. That's not a good sign." Another responded with, "Some women don't show their claws until the dust settles." Lillian didn't flinch. She poured the hot water into her mug, dropped in a single tea bag, and stirred slowly. A plan was forming in her mind, but like puff-puff batter, it needed to rise before it could fry. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Later that afternoon, when most of the extended family had left with their souvenir bags and leftover plantain chips, Lillian returned to the bedroom and locked the door. The air was dense with secrets. The laptop, now fully charged, rested on the bed like a relic waiting to be read. With deliberate fingers, she opened it and entered the only password she could think of, Caleb's birthday. The screen flickered, then opened like a mouth finally ready to speak. Folders upon folders stared back at her. Land titles, vehicle logs, legal drafts, Mayfield shops. Malcolm had not been careless. He had been cautious. There were scanned copies of deeds, voice notes to someone named Hodge, and photographs of building plans. Lillian clicked through everything slowly, her eyes catching on one folder marked Pending Wills. Inside was a letter, unfinished but dated just 2 weeks before his death. It read, "In the event that I am unable to finalize these changes, my wife Lillian is to assume full authority over all properties and accounts under my name until Caleb turns 25. My brothers are not to be included unless she consents." Her hand shook. It wasn't a will in the legal sense, but it was enough to show intent. Her instincts had been right. Malcolm had been preparing, and now it was her job to finish what he started. She copied everything onto a flash drive, then printed select documents using the old Canon printer Malcolm kept for emergencies. As the pages slipped out one by one, Lillian whispered under her breath, "You built the walls, Malcolm. I'll make sure no one breaks them down." By evening, Greenwalk's gate creaked open again. This time, Patrick arrived with Felix, both wearing expressions far too cheerful for men whose brother had only recently been buried. Patrick walked in like a man returning to what he believed was his inheritance. He clapped once, loudly, as he entered the living room. "Ah, Lillian, we were just passing by. Thought we'd check how you're holding up." Felix grinned sheepishly, holding a bottle of wine wrapped in shiny foil. "For the house," he said. Lillian, already seated with her documents beside her, gestured toward the couch. "Sit," she said, her tone smooth but flat like cold water. The men exchanged a glance, sensing something had shifted, but took their seats anyway. Patrick cleared his throat. "So, about Malcolm's affairs, I'm sure he must have left some instructions?" Lillian didn't respond immediately. She picked up the brown envelope beside her, slowly opened it, and pulled out a copy of the drafted letter, the title deeds, and a typed list of properties, all in Malcolm's handwriting or signed in his name. She laid them on the coffee table like a game of cards. "He did," she said, "and I've already contacted his lawyer, Mr. Hodge. We'll be meeting this week to formalize everything." The brothers stiffened. Felix blinked too fast. Patrick reached for the paper, but Lillian stopped him with a look that could still fire into stone. "Touch nothing," she said quietly. "You thought I didn't know, but I did. I heard you." By the wall near the garden. Every word. Silence clamped the room like a vice. Patrick's mouth opened, then closed again, no words forming. Felix looked at the floor as if it might rescue him, but the floor had no sympathy. Lillian leaned back, arms folded. "This is my home. You're only visitors now." That night, the compound felt different. The air carried weight, as though even the trees were whispering that something had changed. News had begun to spread, first as whispers, then as bold retellings. Lillian hadn't shouted. She hadn't cried. She had simply revealed truths like someone peeling yam skin, slow, firm, and without apology. Inside her room, she sat cross-legged on the bed, rereading Malcolm's notes, circling things with a red pen like a woman marking paths in a forest she now had to walk alone. Her phone buzzed. Caleb's name lit the screen. She answered with a calmness that startled even her. "Mom," he said, "I'm booking my flight. I should be back by Friday." Her lips curved faintly, the first real sign of warmth in days. "Good," she said. "I need your voice here." After the call ended, she went to the wardrobe and brought out an old shoebox filled with receipts, tax forms, and photos. She began sorting them meticulously, placing them into new files, labeling each one in block letters. The sound of paper against paper became her lullaby. She didn't need much. Sleep still danced at the edge of her eyelids like a visitor who hadn't decided to stay, but she was awake, fully and painfully awake. Somewhere between betrayal and duty, Lillian had found a new version of herself, one that could smile without joy, speak without rage, and fight without violence. She wasn't planning revenge. She was preparing justice. And justice, when brewed slow, often tastes sweeter than anyone expects. The next morning arrived with a drizzle that painted the walls of Green Walk with quiet sorrow, as though even the sky was mourning something beyond Malcolm's death. Lillian stood under the veranda roof, arms crossed, watching as water gathered in tiny rivulets by the flower bed Malcolm once tended. He used to say roses didn't need loudness to be beautiful, they just bloomed. And that was how she felt now. No fireworks, no trumpet-blown vengeance, just a bloom of quiet defiance, slowly unfolding in the face of betrayal. She turned from the rain and went back inside, where Malcolm's papers were now neatly stacked in chronological order across the dining table. It looked like the desk of a librarian preparing for war. She had slept only 2 hours, but her mind felt sharper than it had in days. She picked up her phone and dialed the number saved under M.H. Lawyer. The voice that answered was calm, worn by years of negotiation and cold courtrooms. "Mrs. Lillian Moore," he said, "I was expecting your call." She closed her eyes, her fingers clutching the edge of the table. "Mr. Hodge, I believe you knew my husband." A pause, just long enough to carry weight, then he replied, "Yes, and I know what he intended. I was helping him prepare a new will. He didn't finish, but he sent me everything he wanted done. I still have the email drafts." Lillian's grip softened. "Can you meet me today?" she asked. "Not at my house. Somewhere neutral." He agreed, and they settled on a small law cafe in Brookhurst, the kind of place where handshakes were more binding than some court papers. After the call, Lillian opened Malcolm's folder titled Legacy Notes and stared at his first sentence. "If I go before I prepare the soil, let her carry the seeds." It was no legal clause, but to Lillian it was more binding than ink on parchment. The drive to Brookhurst was long, winding through roads that wore the weight of years, like aging storytellers. Lillian drove Malcolm's Camry, still smelling faintly of his cologne, past rusted signboards and sleepy fruit stalls, her mind replaying every word she'd heard behind the garden wall. Every bump in the road felt like a memory shaking loose from her chest. When she arrived, the cafe looked exactly as she hoped, discreet, shadowed by tall trees, with chairs placed far enough apart for privacy. Mr. Hodge was already seated by a corner window, a leather-bound folder beside his cup of coffee. He was older than she imagined, gray-bearded, bespectacled, with a voice like a bedtime story told in gravel and grace. "You look like your husband described," he said, motioning for her to sit. Lillian, always modest, gave a small smile. "I'm only here because he trusted you." Hodge opened the folder and laid out the documents like an altar. "He intended to transfer every property to you until your son comes of age. The only reason it wasn't finalized was because he wanted to update the trustees." Lillian listened carefully, her eyes scanning every line. The names of the shops, the house in Mayfield, the accounts, all documented in his hand or through emails. Hodge looked up. "I can help you file an emergency trust petition. It won't be smooth. His brothers may contest it, but the digital trail is strong. It shows intent. That matters." Lillian's eyes shimmered with uncried tears. "He was trying to protect me," she murmured. "And now I have to protect what he built." They spent an hour arranging the strategy, organizing dates, listing witnesses. When she stood to leave, Hodge added quietly, "You're stronger than you think, Mrs. Moore. Don't wait for them to attack. Act first." Lillian nodded, her heart a drumbeat louder than her steps. Back at Greenwalk, the air had shifted again. Patrick and Felix hadn't returned, but word had reached them, through cousins who couldn't keep secrets if their tongues were tied. Lillian could feel it in the way her phone buzzed with unrecognized numbers and text messages pretending to be check-ins. She ignored them all. Instead, she sat in the living room with a paper and pen, drafting a letter to her late husband's tenants, informing them that rent payments would now be made to her directly, with receipts to be issued from a new ledger. She signed it Lillian Moore, trustee of the Moore estate. Each stroke of her pen was deliberate, like a sword drawn without noise. When she finished, she went to the back of the house and began clearing Malcolm's study. The room still smelled of old paper and aftershave. She found books he had bookmarked, contracts he'd edited in red ink, and a drawer full of old photographs. She sat on the floor and flipped through them slowly, watching time peel itself open. There were photos of their wedding, Caleb as a toddler smeared with yam porridge, Malcolm by his first door with his arms wide open like he was embracing the future. She held one photo close, Malcolm smiling under an umbrella during their last beach trip. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew they'd try. That's why you left me the pieces." Outside, the breeze picked up, rattling the window like an impatient guest. Lillian stood, placed the photo on the shelf, and locked the study door. She had turned the page, and this new chapter wasn't written with ink, it was etched in will. The next day, as the first rooster crowed in the distance, Lillian woke to a knock on the gate. It was barely 6, and the compound was still soaked in dawn's hush. She peered through the curtain and saw Felix standing with 2 unfamiliar men, both holding brown envelopes and clipboards. Her chest tightened, but she didn't panic. Instead, she washed her face, tied her scarf, and stepped out barefoot, her steps calm but alert. "Good morning, Felix," she said, voice as light as dew but sharp enough to cut a lie. "To what do I owe this visit?" Felix cleared his throat, clearly rehearsed. "These gentlemen are surveyors. We came to reevaluate the compound. Just a routine thing. You know, upkeep and all." Lillian tilted her head. "Upkeep? Of my property?" One of the men shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was off. "We were told the family requested this," he said. "We were paid to measure and report back for legal adjustments." Lillian took a step closer. "Did the payment come with ownership papers?" she asked, voice still soft. The men exchanged glances. "No, ma, just coordinates and instructions from a Mr. Felix Moore." Lillian smiled, but her eyes didn't. "You've been misled. Kindly return that envelope to whoever sent you. Or better still, tell him I'm waiting, with documents and a lawyer." Felix tried to speak, but the words stuttered at his lips like stubborn beans in a dry pot. Lillian turned without another word and walked back inside, leaving the gate swinging in the wind like a door that had chosen its loyalty. That morning, she called Mr. Hodge and said, "It's time we filed that petition." The chessboard had been touched, and now it was her move. The courthouse in Brookhurst was nothing like the grand, echoing halls of movies. It was modest, with faded cream walls and benches that had carried the weight of many weary backs. On the morning of the hearing, the clouds hung low like heaven's curtain had yet to rise. Lillian stood outside the building with Mr. Hodge beside her, her hands folded tightly around her black purse. She wore a dark green blouse and a long skirt that swept the ground with quiet dignity. Her eyes didn't flinch, not even when Felix and Patrick arrived with their lawyer, a man who wore his suit like armor, but whose eyes darted like mice in daylight. The air between them crackled with unspoken history. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old books, legal tension, and someone's poorly disguised body spray. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Lillian remained composed, her spine like a ruler pressed between her shoulders. Hodge spoke with the precision of a man who had danced with truth. So often it now followed his lead. He presented Malcolm's emails, voice notes, draft letters, and business documents, each bearing his signature, each pointing to Lillian as the intended trustee. Felix tried to interrupt, but the judge waved him off like a buzzing fly. Patrick's lawyer cited tradition, claiming the estate should revert to Malcolm's next male kin, but when pressed for evidence, all they had was talk and half-baked intentions. As the hearing stretched past noon, murmurs rose among the observers. The judge, a woman with silver hair and a voice smooth as burnt sugar, finally leaned forward. "Intent carries weight," she said, "and the evidence before this court shows deliberate preparation by the deceased in favor of the widow." Lillian didn't smile. She simply bowed her head slightly, like a soldier receiving a medal that came too late for celebration. Back at Greenwalk, the compound had transformed into a living metaphor. The weeds in the garden had started to die out, as if bowing to a new caretaker. Even the house seemed to breathe easier, its silence now a comfort rather than a threat. Lillian sat on the veranda, a file of documents resting on her lap, and watched the compound boys wash the Camry, while Caleb dusted the photo frames in the living room. Her son had returned the day before with a presence that filled every empty corner. His voice a softer echo of Malcolm's, his eyes a steady reassurance. They didn't talk much about what happened, but there was an unspoken pact between them: protect the legacy, guard the truth, never blink first. As dusk rolled in like warm soup after rain, a knock came at the gate. Caleb opened it to find Felix, alone and visibly aged, his arrogance now folded like clothes left too long in the rain. "I came to speak with your mother," he said, his voice rough like gravel under a tired shoe. Caleb let him in, but stayed close enough to intervene. Lillian didn't rise. She looked at Felix as one would look at an old newspaper, something once loud but now only useful for wrapping fish. "You've come," she said, not as a welcome, but as a fact. Felix cleared his throat. "I wanted to apologize. I didn't know Malcolm had made all those plans. She raised her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No, you didn't want to know. You saw silence and mistook it for weakness. You saw my tears and thought they meant I had no teeth. But grief sharpens more than pain ever could." Felix lowered his gaze, and for the first time she saw regret, not the dramatic, teary-eyed kind, but the quiet realization that he had gambled with dignity and lost. She didn't offer him a seat. She didn't need to. Sometimes grace looks like restraint. 3 days later, Lillian made her first public move as trustee. She walked into the Mayfield Plaza, once handled entirely by Malcolm, and addressed the tenants who had grown uncertain since his passing. She wore a brown lace dress with flat sandals, no makeup, her face bare and unhidden. The tenants, ranging from tailors to tech repairmen, stood quietly as she spoke with clarity and assurance. "I know you've heard stories," she began, her voice calm, her posture unbending. "But let me be clear, nothing changes. Your leases remain intact. Your rents will be honored. What changes is accountability. I will not collect from you and forget your roofs are leaking. I will not take and ignore your struggles." She handed out new receipts, distributed her direct contact information, and introduced Caleb as the new overseer. The people clapped, not the loud kind that comes from excitement, but the steady kind that comes from respect. As they dispersed, a woman who ran a provision store walked up to Lillian and whispered, "He would be proud." Lillian blinked back tears, smiled softly, and nodded. "I hope so," she said. Later that evening, she stood on the upstairs balcony of her home, watching the moon rise slow and wide like a promise finally kept. She had buried her husband, endured betrayal, stood in court, and emerged without bitterness. What they thought would break her had only introduced her to a part of herself she had never met, and now that part was fully awake. The weeks that followed moved with the pace of healing, uneven, patient, and quietly miraculous. Lillian restored order to Malcolm's business records, sold off a property he had once considered a burden, and used the proceeds to renovate the family house. She repainted the rooms, replaced old roofing sheets, and installed a new gate that swung shut without complaint. The neighbors noticed. They stopped gossiping and started greeting. The compound that once carried whispers now hummed with calm activity, like a garden once trampled finally beginning to bloom again. On a quiet Sunday, Caleb sat beside his mother under the almond tree, flipping through a scrapbook filled with pictures and scribbled quotes Malcolm used to write on paper napkins. One read, "The loudest revenge is peace." Lillian chuckled when she saw it, then leaned back and exhaled deeply. She hadn't taken revenge. She had taken back what was already hers. Felix and Patrick had gone quiet. Word was they had begun fighting amongst themselves over a separate land dispute, another pot they had stirred too often. Lillian didn't bother to verify. She had no appetite for stale noise. That night, as she prepared for bed, she placed Malcolm's journal beside her pillow. She opened to the last entry, which simply read, "If she ever finds this, tell her I tried." She whispered, "You didn't fail." And as she turned off the lamp, a gust of wind blew through the curtain, brushing her cheek like a ghostly kiss. It wasn't closure. It was something deeper. The kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from surviving with your soul intact. The peace that had settled in Greenwalk did not arrive without the occasional rattle at the windows. Just as rain brings new life, but also floods old roots, Lillian's quiet restoration was not without resistance from ghosts that still roamed in living flesh. One late evening, just as the sun bled slowly into the spine of the sky, Caleb returned from the plaza with a furrowed brow and a sealed envelope in his hand. Lillian looked up from her chair, where she had been crocheting beside the open window, the breeze gently combing through the loose strands of her scarf. "What's that?" she asked, already sensing the answer from the way he held it like a stone that burned. Caleb dropped it on the center table, careful but firm. "Someone served us," he said. Lillian stared at the bold print stamped across the paper, notice of objection, claim on property, the words shouting from the page like uninvited guests. Felix and Patrick, unable to swallow their failed attempt to control, had filed a new petition through a shadowy local court in Port Greer, hoping to bypass the decisions made in Brookhurst. It was an old trick, the kind that only worked when the intended target was asleep at the wheel. But Lillian was not sleeping. She was wide awake, and now she was tired of playing gentle. "So they want war without boundary," she muttered, folding the edge of her wrapper with deliberate calm. "Then let them drink the rain they've summoned." She rose and reached for the file cabinet by the corner. "Tell Mr. Hodge we'll respond within 48 hours. If they want to test foundation, let them meet Stone." 2 days later, they drove into Port Greer, a coastal town that looked innocent on the outside, but was soaked in whispers and sideways glances. The courthouse there was smaller than Brookhurst's, but thicker with politics. Everyone knew someone. Every corridor had ears. Lillian, dressed in ash-colored native attire, carried herself like someone born for the long road. She didn't flinch at the staring eyes or the muffled laughter behind cupped hands. Mr. Hodge met them at the gate with a folder tucked beneath his arm and a look of mild irritation under his calm veneer. "They've hired a new lawyer," he said. "Young. Dangerous only to the unprepared." Lillian gave a small nod. "Then it's a good thing we came with loaded barrels." Inside the courtroom, Felix and Patrick sat on the opposite bench, avoiding her gaze, but carrying the smug posture of men who believed they still had one last card to play. The hearing opened with loud arguments from their side, claims of cultural inheritance, fabricated records, and references to land traditions from decades prior. But the moment Hodge began to speak, the temperature shifted. He brought forward witness statements from tenants, copies of rental transfers, the original digital logs from Malcolm's laptop, and audio messages confirming Lillian's role long before the funeral. But it was when Caleb played the voice note, the one where Malcolm, coughing but clear, said, "If I don't make it, let Lillian steer this ship," that the courtroom truly paused. It wasn't law anymore. It was blood. It was truth wrapped in a voice no one could mimic. The judge postponed the final ruling for deliberation, but the eyes in the room had already shifted. Lillian didn't smile, but her silence screamed louder than any victory chant. That evening, back in the rented guest house, Caleb sat on the floor, his head resting against the foot of the bed, fingers scrolling slowly through his father's old notes on his tablet. Lillian stood by the window, watching the dim lights of Port Greer shimmer like lies waiting to be told. Do you think they'll stop? Caleb asked. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen his mother fight too long, too quietly. Lillian turned toward him, her arms folded beneath her chest. Men who start fires without counting the wind never expect the flame to chase them home, she replied. Caleb sighed, not in defeat, but in understanding. The road back to Greenwalk was long and uneven, but there was an odd comfort in the rocking of the car, as if the journey itself was reminding them that every step forward was a declaration of survival. When they arrived, neighbors peeked through their curtains, curious yet careful. The rumors had run ahead of them like town criers with no master. That night, as Lillian unpacked her bag, she paused at the framed photo of Malcolm on her bedside table. His eyes, still frozen in that knowing smile, seemed to whisper, "Keep going." She touched the frame gently, then sat on the bed, scribbling updates in the journal she now kept, a journal titled simply, His and Hers. And when the power blinked off momentarily and came back on, she smiled to herself. Even darkness knew when it had overstayed its welcome. Days turned into weeks, and the final ruling from Port Greer arrived in an envelope carried by courier and handed to Caleb at the plaza. He tore it open under the shade of the bakery's awning, read it twice, and let out a long, low whistle. "They dismissed it," he said when he reached home. Lillian was in the kitchen, slicing okra with rhythmic precision. She didn't turn. "Completely?" she asked. Caleb handed her the letter. "With sanctions. The judge said it was a deliberate abuse of legal process and ordered them to pay a penalty." Lillian didn't gloat. She wiped her hands on a cloth and took a deep breath. "Then we can finally breathe without checking the windows first." She walked out to the backyard where the orange tree had begun to fruit again. Malcolm had planted it during their 10th year together. For a while, it bore nothing but leaves. Then suddenly, this year, it bloomed. She plucked one fruit, turned it in her palm, and said aloud, what they tried to steal wasn't land. It was dignity. But you can't steal what someone has already buried deep in their spine. That night she invited the compound boys, a few friends, and their longtime staff for dinner. No ceremony. Just laughter, food, and music played from the old radio Malcolm once fixed when it nearly caught fire. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer had the final word. And for Lillian, that was enough. Peace, hard-earned and gently placed like a shawl across her shoulders, had finally come to stay. The harmattan arrived like an old visitor who didn't knock, dusty, dry, and unapologetic. The trees in Greenwalk stood still as if listening for news carried on the wind. Lillian sat on the back porch with a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the early chill nipping at her fingertips as she sipped tea from her chipped ceramic mug. The calm was real this time, not the kind that waits for another storm, but the kind that follows a long rain and stays. Caleb had returned to school overseas, promising to keep the estate's affairs in check remotely. He left with a smile and the same phrase his father used to mutter whenever things felt too large to hold, brick by brick. Lillian had smiled then, but now, alone in the house that had once echoed with voices and tension, she understood the weight of those words. Peace wasn't a gift, it was something you protected with both hands. The compound had grown quiet, the distant laughter of neighborhood children, the only melody weaving through the rustle of the dry season. She placed her mug on the bench beside her and opened Malcolm's journal once more. She had filled its remaining pages not with pain, but with process, how she handled accounts, met tenants, fought in court, and learned how to balance legacy without losing herself in the shadows of a man's name. Each sentence she wrote became a step toward something firmer, like stones laid across muddy ground. She flipped to the first page again and read his handwriting. If she ever finds this, let her know she's more than enough. This time, the tears didn't sting. They simply flowed, warm and weightless, washing her clean. One afternoon, she received a call from a man she barely remembered, Obiora, a distant cousin of Malcolm's, who had once lived abroad but returned to Norwood and started a real estate firm. His tone was polite, seasoned with caution. "Auntie Lillian," he began, "I know what the family did. I stayed out of it because I didn't want to be dragged in. But I heard everything. I watched quietly." Lillian listened, saying nothing, her silence weighing more than any reply. He continued, "I want to meet with you. Not for land or favors, but because I think you could help me structure something." When they met days later in a quiet cafe near Elmsbridge, Obiora laid out plans to redevelop a housing project that had collapsed after corruption buried the initial investors. "I want it done right this time," he said. "Transparent, accountable, and I want a name people trust." Lillian blinked slowly, letting his words settle. She wasn't eager for noise, but something in her stirred. Maybe healing wasn't just about surviving the past, but about proving you could build again, with wiser hands and cleaner hearts. She agreed to consult quietly, behind the scenes. No title, no fanfare. Just her mind, her records, and her voice when needed. As they parted ways that day, Obiora turned back and said, "Uncle Malcolm would have trusted you with his last coin." Lillian didn't respond. She simply touched the edge of her shawl and kept walking, the road before her long but no longer unfamiliar. Weeks passed and the project took shape. Every Saturday, Lillian would travel to Elmsbridge to review files, meet with contractors, and suggest changes most people overlooked, details that built trust long before cement dried. Her presence at meetings changed the room. People spoke with fewer riddles, papers were signed in daylight, and even the cleaners began to greet her with respect that didn't ask for a smile in return. At night, back in Greenwalk, she would light a scented candle Malcolm once brought home as a joke. Why would a candle smell like rain? He had laughed. Now, she lit it to mark progress, not grief. Neighbors often asked why she still lived in the same house despite the opportunity to move. But Lillian would reply with a shrug and say, "When a tree grows deep roots, it doesn't envy potted plants." One evening, as she trimmed the hedge Malcolm planted years ago, she heard her name called softly from behind. It was Felix, thin, slower, and humbled by time. He came bearing nothing but his hands, empty and open. "I don't want to fight anymore," he said. "I've lost too much already." Lillian didn't ask what he meant. She just looked at him, long and hard, then pointed to a garden bench. He sat. They didn't talk about the past. Not that day. Some things aren't repaired. They're just acknowledged and left in the corner, like old shoes you no longer wear but can't throw away. They spoke of Malcolm's youth, of a football match in their boyhood, and of nothing that could start a fire. When Felix left, she didn't walk him out. She didn't need to. Some goodbyes don't need steps, just stillness. 1 year after Malcolm's burial, the sun rose lazily over Greenwalk, as if time had finally exhaled. Lillian, dressed in a soft cream blouse, simple trousers, and leather sandals. She carried no purse, no folder, just a small envelope. She walked through the compound where everything now thrived. The tree bore fruits. The house gleamed with fresh paint, and laughter returned like a healed song. She arrived at the community town hall, where Obiora's project had officially been commissioned. He asked her to cut the ribbon. She refused. Instead, she handed him the envelope. "This is the only thing I want my name on," she said. Inside were architectural revisions and operational guidelines she had quietly drawn up for the next 5 years. "I'm stepping back," she added. "I've done what I came to do." Obiora, unsure whether to protest or thank her, simply bowed. As she walked home, market women waved, children ran past her barefoot, and a gentle breeze played with her scarf. She reached her front gate just as the wind blew the curtain in her living room window. She paused, stared at the house, and felt no ache. That night she made jollof rice, set 2 plates, and placed one before Malcolm's empty chair, not in mourning, but in memory. She ate quietly, smiled once, then packed the dishes. Before turning out the light, she whispered, "They tried to take everything, but I left nothing behind for them to steal. Only love stayed." And with that, she climbed into bed, pulled the blanket over her shoulder, and finally, without worry, slept like a woman who had won, not loudly, but completely. Sometimes life strips you bare in full view of those who want to see you fall. It shakes your walls, tests your patience, and hands you silence when all you want is a voice. But don't mistake stillness for defeat. Like Lillian, there is power in being quiet when you could have screamed. There is wisdom in gathering your strength before showing your hand. Not every war is won with shouting. Some victories come quietly, wrapped in dignity and soaked in prayer. If you are going through a season where people are plotting behind your back, don't rush to speak. Let your strength build like a tide. Let your actions become your voice. The world may not clap when you rise, but heaven will take notice. And when you finally take back what's yours, not just property, but peace, identity, and purpose, do it without bitterness. That is how you win fully. May the God who sees in secret fight for you in public. May he silence every whisper plotting your downfall and turn every buried truth into a platform for your rising. May he give you wisdom like Lillian's, measured, quiet, and mighty. May your enemies trip over the very traps they set for you, and may your home be filled not just with light, but with laughter again. May your hands never lack strength, your name never lack honor, and your soul never lack peace. And when the final chapter of your trial is written, may it read like Lillian's. She didn't just survive, she reclaimed everything. In Jesus' name, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.